Hello everybody, I'm Leila Sharda. I'm a clinical academic nurse from Lancashire and South Cumbria Foundation Trust. I work across all of our partner universities, but I have an honorary contract with Lancaster Medical School. Thanks, Karen. I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about the Educator Mental Health Project, but also the narrative synthesis that I'm using the Normalisation Process Theory Code and Manual for Qualitative Research for as an analytical framework. Okay, so I'm going to give you some background to the Educator Mental Health Project, and that will help me to make sense of why I chose to use the MPT coding framework. We're all very familiar with the policy drivers for co-production and involvement in clinical education in mental health. There's a very clear philosophical and ethical rationale for involving service users in our work. It's the gold standard in everything that we should be doing. And there was lots of experiential knowledge in education and in other pillars of practice. But there are a number of research issues, and that is that the terminology used in the way that we involve and co-produce with educators is vast. We are information specialists at the Trust identified 30 synonyms. So it's really difficult to find evidence when we can't type in a search and look for it with particular ease. It's a really under-researched area of practice is co-production and involvement in education, and particularly in medical education. We found 5 empirical papers when we attempted to do a review on involvement in psychiatry in medical education. And it's because it's a particularly complex area to research. The interrelationship between the learning environment, different student groups, the way that we tailor our work to individual students. Lots of students have their own lived experience, and of course the knowledge and experience of individual educators that come and work alongside us. There's a huge gap in knowledge, and it's an under-theorised area of practice. And consequently, we run the risk of having some very implausible theoretical ideas about the way that this works. When you look at the literature, I think Janet mentioned it earlier, it talks about lots of the positives about co-production and involvement. But we make big knowledge claims. We make claims that involvement of people who have lived experience will break down barriers, will challenge stereotypes. We're asking people to do really big things. And of course, in mental health, we know that there is epistemic injustice linked to psychiatric diagnosis. So epistemic injustice concerned with the validity of knowledge. We bring people along, we ask them to talk to students. Students may not find their knowledge to be credible, they may not find it to be particularly valid, and we run the risk of deepening those epistemic injustices for the people that we want to involve. And epistemic injustice, do you know what, I'll save my throat, please just read the quote. Okay. And there are other contextual risks when we think about co-production and involvement in clinical education, and that is that in mental health we've got a really depleted clinical workforce, and we're quite reliant on finding new ways to educate the next generation of clinical professionals. And we run the risk of commodifying lived experience in education if we don't do this properly. There's a very limited evidence base in the NHS context for clinical education and involvement in co-production. And we run the risk, obviously, for individual educators of tokenism. The literature tells us lots about tokenistic involvement. We run the risk of burdening people by asking them to tell stories, by asking them to challenge these very entrenched stereotypes. And we run the risk of very uncritical solicitation of patient stories. We ask people who have lived experience of mental health problems to come along and respond to very unpredictable, often student emotion. And we're quite unclear about what the role for educators by professional experience should be as part of that work. Should we be co-producing? Should we be doing co-facilitation? What is our role with supervision, debriefing, peer support? Should we have some communities of practice? There are a number of implementation issues when we start to think about how we should be doing this. And we need to understand how optimally to organise and deliver co-production and involvement in clinical education in mental health, and particularly in the NHS setting, where we're working with people who are not always healthy volunteers. We're working with people who are currently under services, and we have a duty of care. We also need to ensure that educators, by lived experience, contribute to high quality learning that meets the curriculum requirements. And of course, we're not wasting people's time if we know that we're involving people in good quality education. So, which leads me to this narrative synthesis, which I'm undertaking as part of that piece of work. This is a narrative synthesis that is looking for across all disciplines, exploring involvement in clinical education in mental health. I want to look at the evidence base, so I'm only including empirical papers as part of this review, and we do plan to do a separate grey literature search later. We did 163 title and abstract checks in Rayan, 45 studies met the selection criteria, they were screened with the mixed methods appraisal tool, and we excluded 15 papers due to quality. There are 31 papers included in the review. Okay, 2 minutes. Not surprisingly, most of the studies identified were in nursing, but we retained some in medicine, pharmacy, social work, psychology and OT, just one multidisciplinary paper. Most of the studies in nursing are actually from the same research group, interestingly, so that there really isn't a lot of work that's been done kind of more broadly. Mostly descriptive studies, 7 in the UK, only 1 in a clinical setting, a combination of focus groups and interviews, or a mixture of the two. So because I wanted to look at implementation, I didn't want to look at ideology. We know what the ideology is. I wanted to look at how we should be doing this practically. I chose to use the MPT framework for qualitative research. The theory goes in their paper that this reduces the cognitive and practical burden for researchers who want to look at implementation. It's an action theory. It's concerned with what people do. It's not concerned with actions or beliefs. And it offers an explanatory framework to describe, assess and improve implementation. And there's 4 main components of it: coherence, cognitive participation, collective action and reflexive monitoring. But what the framework does is it provides a ready-to-use framework that can be coded directly into In Vivo 14, and it simplifies the application of the theory. And this is really useful in this piece of work because often we've tried to involve patients or experts by lived experience as part of our work without really planning the process, and it's become an organic policy, an organic protocol for the way that these things are delivered. They're often very locally thought up. So this is a really good theory to try and unravel what has happened and to understand implementation. The 12 primary constructs map onto realist methods, context, implementation mechanisms and outcomes. The problems that I found with using this framework is if you're not familiar with realist methods, it would be probably quite difficult to untangle the difference between the context, the mechanisms and the outcomes. When you read academic papers, trying to untangle barriers, facilitators and implementation components is a bit tricky. And I've got a few concerns about intercode reliability. I'm not convinced that everybody would code similarly. The review's still ongoing, and I'm hoping that I will untangle some of that work as I go on. But I'm just going to give some headlines of what I've found so far in the literature. So looking at contexts, the world that we live in, the way that we operate, educator by experience programs in mental health, what are the current involvement issues in clinical education? How does implementation in the mental health context differ from other specialties, if it does? Well, in mental health, we have historically operated within reductionist biomedical frameworks for understanding disease, and in mental health, harking back to the asylums and the clinical gaze, and we know we need to involve people as active participants in mental health care. We've got a very clear policy position. Involvement and co-production shifts power. In terms of what workarounds have made involvement possible in mental health contexts, well, in the literature, we learn that recruitment and retention hasn't really been given adequate attention, time or resources. So what we've done is we have involved service users in storytelling that is positive and often uncomplicated. And what we have done is we have excluded people who we consider to be unpredictable. And in terms of how easily involvement fits into existing ways of working and delivering clinical education, well, we've retained our culture of professional expertise, and we've made sure that involvement has been grafted on nicely to established structures and working practices. We've involved people who've got professional expertise that fits within our framework, for example, school teachers with prior experience of public speaking. And if we think about how the context of reframing organisational logic, how involvement has changed, thinking about clinical education, whether we do think about educators by lived experience as legitimate and equal educators, within the literature, the aspirations for transformative change, they're really clear. But what isn't clear is how students optimally learn with rather than about service users. Pause. Okay, if I'll go through some of the mechanisms that are reported in the literature. So this idea of coherence, how people work together to understand and plan the activities that need to be accomplished to develop and deliver involvement in clinical education. Well, it's clear that there's considerable labour involved to plan coherent activities, and this labour is often unrecognised. There are no pedagogical frameworks identified in the literature, and dominantly a storytelling approach is used. There's lots of reference to educators by lived experience requiring individual prep, training and support, but it's not really clarified in the literature what that is. And in terms of cognitive participation, how people work together to create networks of participation and communities of practice, well, for some people, going into a university setting legitimised participation, but some educators reported in the literature that they felt wheeled out. Social circumstances were a real issue for participation, for full participation, because a lot of people didn't come from education environments, they had self-doubt, they didn't feel that their own educational levels were such to justify their participation at that level, and this put people off, and there was a real gap in the literature about what a community of practice should look like. How people work together to deliver involvement in clinical education and the daily weekly tasks and how they're achieved. I was very interested in that. And there was this idea, this thread about partnership that came through the literature, but partnership was very individual, and a lot of professional educators reported in the literature that they didn't have the time or expertise to develop those partnerships. But there was a gap in the literature looking at what support in education was needed by professional educators to get more involved in that type of work. In terms of reflexive monitoring, how people work together to appraise and evaluate involvement in clinical education aspects of it, reflection and debrief was considered to be really important in the literature, but I didn't find any structured models. We don't know the correct ways to engage in this work, and support and follow-up again was often cited as important, but what that should entail was rarely described. So if we think about outcomes and how the intervention of patient involvement in education has been normalised, it's used for question and answer sessions. What is it like to be an inpatient? Storytelling, the dominant approach, but do we ask ourselves, can learners interpret the message that's intended? Educators they take part in role play, they take part in simulation. I did find one paper where they developed scenarios, and people with lived experience were acting out a scenario that was not their own lived experience. And they take the simulated patient role themselves and allow students to take clinical interviews. But why do we use each approach? And what is being lost in the artificial classroom environment? When we're looking at all of these different ways to provide education, we have to understand why we're using each approach. And the cost benefit of involving people with lived experience in mental health is quite unclear. In terms of how practices have changed as a result of developing and facilitating involvement over time and across settings, the literature reports benefits and enjoyment, but not very much about learning. And of course, involvement is not without risk. We really do need robust evaluation of different aspects of involvement in clinical education in mental health. We read a lot about the relational restructure and stuff that we hope that involvement people with lived experience can bring about as a result of them participating in education. But the literature is clear that some professional educators experience quite a lot of discomfort with the performative aspects of storytelling. Students themselves might find particular discomfort when an educator's story jars with their own experiences. And one of the things that was interesting I found in the literature was this idea of emotional processing of the story might be key to learning. We have to understand a little bit more about that, because how are we making sure that that emotional processing is contained and managed and people are supported, students and educators? And of course, if we don't think about that, there's a risk of unintended consequences. So how is involving patients or experts by experience in clinical education change norms, rules, resources that govern our actions? Well, when the teaching resulted in a shift in understanding, there was behaviour change in practice. There was less emphasis on paperwork, improved assessment skills, improved communication skills. And we really have to think about how we can optimise the conditions for behaviour change. We have to understand this a lot more than we already do. So in summary, we do need to have a better theoretical understanding of co-production and involvement in mental health. And we have to understand the conditions for behaviour change and the unintended consequences of good intentions. We need better evaluation in this area. And I think the MPT framework has been really useful to try and unpick some of that stuff. I found it very helpful, if not laborious. I'd welcome any questions before my voice comes out. Thank you.
I was the key to learning sometimes is having a laugh. And the fact that somebody can really remember it, although there's all the reflection stuff, so I think you've got something to look at there, because I think if you enjoy learning together,
yeah,
that's transformation in itself.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's I'm sort of struggling with, not struggling, but reflecting all the way through, because we've all worked, it's always trying to think, and you said the cost, it's almost emotional labour sometimes.
Yes.
And then it's thinking, what fits? How do we transform? How do we stop making those conversations that it's not just bringing somebody in?
Yeah.
It's somebody who's got that expertise as well.
Yeah.
Confidence. So I think your work is so important.
Thank you.
Yeah, nicely themed as well, actually.
Yes.
In relation to what we've been talking about. No, Karen did. She's always quiet with a reflexive background.
Yeah, you ask a lot of good questions there, Leila, and I think, hopefully we're starting to work through some of those answers, aren't we, about theory, about what it is we're hoping to change, behaviour change, attitudes. That's we're starting to shine a light on the the minutiae, the kind of nuance
Yeah.
that's happening in that learning environment. Hopefully we can work together in the future. So.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm getting from Manchester. I know that there are not many implementation theory out there to be used, but I wonder how you come to conclusion that you should use the MPT before you. Are you exploring any other theory or frameworks before deciding that?
I looked across, and there were lots of, Janet referenced some of the different theories that are linked to with regards to educators, but what I was interested in was the practicalities. I'm an NHS nurse. I wanted to know, how do we do this every day? How do we implement this? And so it was the perfect theory for me to try to understand day to day what is happening. And because this looks at late stage innovations, which essentially this is, people have been doing this for years. It's well embedded in practice and educational environments. But how? And this is what I wanted to try and start to unpick. How have we come to do things the way that we do, so that we can think about doing it better?
Thank you.
So what does you got to say about it then, about the best fit? Because my mind's sort of thinking, oh, okay, well, we could have somebody because I get that being wheeled in,
Yeah.
that sort of, okay, here's somebody wheeled in, here's your service user, have a little chat. Not that they're going to meet service users on placement, but that sort of sense of where, they're being embedded as opposed to just kind of bouncing against our boundaries, so to speak. So what you're finding, what's the best fit? What should we do?
I think we need to co-produce a teaching and learning toolkit. We need to get everybody involved, and we need to gain some theory-focused consensus about how we do this. And we need to be realistic about what we expect from educators that come and work alongside us, and make sure that we have adequate safeguards in place to support people who do this very, very labour-intensive work.
Yeah. Well, emotional labour as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just bring up the point where you said feeling wheeled in? When we started UConn, that's how we felt. Our group were fed at that time. I've mentioned it outside as well. I know it's controversial, but our group decided, no, we want to be fully embedded within the university. It took a long time to get it.
Yeah.
Throughout all the universities, we're getting there. Still not everywhere, but we're throughout a lot of it. We made that decision as a group, not the university. Our own group said, no, we want more embedded within the university, and the health nurse, nursing, all of it. And we find that you talk about storytelling. What is the story you're telling? Who are you talking about? You talk about, and somebody says something to me once, well, I want real people. And I said, well, I'm a real person. What are you on about? Well, you know what I mean, but you've been here years. Yeah, but I'm still talking about real things in real life. And when you're in a mental health institute, because I've been in that, because I care for some young and severe ones as well, you can see the difference sometimes in who's actually communicating with users, if you want to call them, patients, whatever you want to call them, within that environment. You can see there's different people within it. And it's being involved with the university to help change that. It's taken, well, nearly 20 years, but we're still getting there. It's still not perfect, but will it ever be perfect?
I'd love to talk to you about your experiences separately.
How long you got? Lunch.
Any other thoughts, guys?
I've witnessed and thinking about Karen behind me as well, that idea of co-creating a learning module or session together. When it's done right, it feels right, it feels equal, it feels democratic, it feels nurturing and therapeutic, doesn't it? But it does take a lot of emotional labour on both sides, I think.
On both sides. I think that's a really important point actually, because sometimes I think that the perception is that it's a challenge for the service user, and you have to acknowledge that without a doubt. Often it's quite an opening of experience, but actually that authentic way of working side by side with an academic is also very challenging for the academic, because they have to move out of this theoretical safety zone into this position of authenticity and to work with that person to create a proper co-produced session Whereas you might think the session is 3 hours, you need 3 hours for preparation. You can triple that. To do it properly, you can triple that.
Yeah.
And you should triple it because it's worth it.
Yeah. One of the things I'd like to do as this work progresses, if I could get funding, is to do a proper economic evaluation.
There is a lot of work that I should mention. Jill Anderson from Lancaster University did a lot of work about this and costing it all out, but unfortunately she never published it.
Ah,
I just put you in touch with
please, thank you.
information about all this.
We've done it with the offender personality disorder pathway.
Yeah.
We've been doing the knowledge of standard framework for personality disorder and everything we produce is co-produced with service users. The service users are paid to go and this on that program. We should write that to actually.
There are some publications out of that, aren't there?
There are. There's 2 pages actually, but there's not one that's focused just on the environmental service use and value of that. But they have been a part of every single stage of it, including being in research and paid equally on academic rates.
Beautiful. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.